Good morning. I'm Kurtis Luckinbill, and I'm teaching today on a subject that none of us like to admit we have ever thought. When you believe God has failed. And I want to cover it all this morning rather than break it into two because I want to keep the continuity of the teaching. So if halfway through this you need a break, just turn off YouTube and come back later. Let me start in two verses that we all know very well and we hear taught thousands of times during our life. Hebrews 12, 4 through 11. Ye have not resisted unto blood, yet ye resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you are rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and he scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then ye are bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of the flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them that are exercised thereby. In James 1, 2 through 4, I just lost my notes there, Jim. Go back to Word. Never came. Sorry. Consider it all joy, my brethren. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let that endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Now, I know that the audience that hears me read these, as I read these scriptures, you're saying, great. Another teaching on trials, circumstances, situations, discipline, and chastisement. And I say no. I want to discuss something you rarely hear taught. What do we see and understand when those dark and uncertain times overshadow us? When we cry out to the Father like a child, when we feel lost and abandoned in the desert, when we are in our most alone moments and those abandoned moments. And let me say this. You say, well, I never really suffer alone. Don't fool yourself. You face those moments alone. It is impossible for any other human to experience your darkest hours. And in fact, Jesus even made this statement in John 16:32, when he said, a time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. Let me repeat this. When we are in our most abandoned moments, you will face them alone. The church today is full of hopeless individuals who live day to day believing that the right attitude, the right prayer, a change of habits, medication, yoga, will heal that dead existence they have inside. They live Sunday to Sunday, hoping that their faith is real and that God actually cares. That He's just not up there watching it all go bad. They leave every Sunday morning believing that there's got to be more. They're going back and forth and doing right and doing wrong. And I like to say this. We're like a squirrel on the interstate. Our fragile identities have left us to be roadkill, waiting for the wrong event at that right moment to lay us waste. It is in those darkest moments that our strength fails. I'm not going to speak this morning as to the why we have trials. Well, a little bit. But to the what we understand. I want to speak to the what we understand when those times happen. Those times when we cry out to the Father in hurt and anger. Do you not care? Why have you forsaken me, Father? If you've never experienced that moment, then you have never come to the end of yourself, the end of your strength. If you have experienced that, then welcome to the process of sonship. It is in these moments that the me and Jesus gospel fails. It is in these moments when religion crumbles to the ground like the mud house built on sand. Let me read a transcribed fictional conversation between God and the character Paul, a New York columnist in the 2018 movie, An Interview with God. Let's pull that up. God says in this movie, there aren't always signs when someone's in trouble, Paul, but you can't hide from me. Why are you doing this to me? Paul, you've only lost your way. You've just lost your way. No, God, you let this happen to me. How so, Paul? I prayed. I know. I begged you for help. And you think bad things happen to you because I don't care? You didn't listen, God. But Paul, bad things happen all the time. Every day. Every minute of every day. You know that. You said it yourself. And it's very sad. But the truth is most people only seem to notice bad things when they happen to them. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. Why don't you help us, God? God responds, I hear you. I hear it all. Why is there war, starvation, poverty, disease, fire, flood? A child goes missing. A man loses hope. Then do something, God. God responds, yes, do something. Why do you think that every Christian movie centers on a person in their greatest moment of despair? Let me tell you something you probably don't want to hear. But God has purposed and designed our failure. God has purposed and designed our failure. Not that it would destroy us, but that it would bring an end to ourselves and our strength. For the purpose that Christ's life may be revealed in our mortal bodies. Within our creation, the Father designed us to be emotionally and physically fragile. He designed us to fail. Let me say that again. The Father designed us to fail because He speaks within that failure. Like the pig, the squealing and whining you hear is the sound of the me and Jesus gospel, the sound of the me and Jesus understanding dying. We spend our entire lives with God's phone number in our speed dial. Theologians teach us that God's number is 1, is 3, is 7. But I will tell you that God's number is 911. We only speak to God when we are in crisis. 911, God. Pull that up. Pull up scriptures here. And the reason is simple. If we did not thirst, we would not drink. If we were never hungry, we would never eat. And if we never failed, we would never seek. Our angry accusations do not move our Father. He waits for those moments when we are angry with Him. For it is in those moments when we lie broken on the floor that He gets our attention and we listen. Most of you listening to me today are embarrassed to confess that there's been times, dire times, when you have been angry with God. You're embarrassed to admit that there's even times when you feel as if He's forsaken you. I have learned not to be. I have learned to wear those times as the scars of sonship, where my failed and erroneous understanding was exchanged for the revelation of His unconditional love for me. But let me say this again. Our Creator designed us to be emotionally and physically fragile. He created us to break. But do you understand why? In 2 Corinthians 4:7-12, but we have this treasure in jars of clay. Anybody handle a clay pot lately? To show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that His life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Many of you, if you're like me, you love music. I love music. And the Father has revealed, using music theory, has revealed an understanding for the purpose of crisis in our life. And I want to share this with you. This was something the Father gave me 2 weeks ago. In music theory, the tritone, or the augmented fourth, which is a C to an F sharp, or a diminished fifth, which is C to a G flat, is dissonant. Dissonant means lacking harmony and harsh in sound. It is a musical technique that creates uneasiness and fear and is well suited for horror movie soundtracks, jazz, rock, and heavy metal music. Just think of the opening bars to the Jaws soundtrack, Or the self-titled song by the band Black Sabbath, who in 1970 introduced tritones to the rock music world. Go ahead, Jim, you have a sample. Let's play that of the piano. This is what tritones sound like. It adds a darkness and power to music. Jim, you have the Sabbath one. Let's listen to what it did to rock music in this one. Like I said, in 1970, Tony Iommi would introduce darkness to rock music like it had never been known before. The grandfather of heavy metal, we now have tritones. It adds darkness and power to music. For centuries, it was called in Latin, Diabolos in Musica, or the devil's interval. Google it. It's everywhere. The Renaissance period sparingly used this musical interval, believing that music's purpose was to express the majesty of God. Music theorists will tell you the tritone dissonance must be resolved. When you listen to that, you heard it. Those notes had to be resolved. They were not. But in order for music to move forward, that note has to be resolved. It is never in rest and does not sound complete on its own. Gerald Moschel, a professor of music at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, has said that tritone wants to go somewhere. It wants to settle either here or there. You don't know where it'll go, but it can't stop where it is. Ending music on a tritone, to me, is like your wife telling you, Kurtis, we need to have a talk about. That statement alone is foreboding and unresolved. It creates uneasiness and that forces the need for resolution. It causes a turmoil that requires rest. You don't know where that statement she's saying is going to go, but you know it can't end there. The first thing you say is, what do we need to talk about? What do we need to talk about? This needs to be resolved before I go to sleep. The darkness of the tritone creates a contrast in music. A contrast, a darkness that makes light meaningful, forcing dissonance to be resolved into rest. Music theorists will tell you that it's a transition that moves music forward. Dissonance always seeks out and requires consonance to be harmonious, pleasant, or acceptable. Now, this is the point. A tritone is to music what crisis is to your life. I want you to remember back to what you heard on the music. That's crisis. Those notes have to be resolved. They cannot continue. They're horrifying, they're chaotic, they're dissonant. Crisis in your life is dissonant, demanding your attention and requiring resolution. I can't go another step forward like this. Crisis pushes you forward to resolution. Crisis to the unbeliever pushes them forward into Christ, while crisis to the believer pushes them forward into an understanding of oneness and their identity as the Son of God. Crisis demands faith, and faith moves the new creation believer forward through the turbulent convergence of oneness. The beauty of this convergence is that it is resolved by the revelation of your true spiritual identity, transforming us into the image of Christ. In 2 Corinthians 3:18, but we all, with unveiled face, beholding as a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. And a verse we love to read, Romans 8:28, 29 and 30. But we all only read 28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. We all know that God causes all things to work together for good, for my good. That's the way we read it. This is bad, but God's going to make it all work out. How do you see that? It'll work out to my good. Now, let's finish that verse with 29 and 30. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Now we have a 4 in there. All things work out together for the good so that we may become conformed to the image of his Son. Now you've got crisis and you've got trials, and in verse 29 he tells you why. But we never read 29. This is our favorite scripture. But our expectations of God far outweigh our understanding of what it means. We think that what we believe is good, what we expect God's good for us, that's the way it's going to turn out. We don't understand that what God's good is that we be conformed to the image of his Son. What is that image? The identity of the Son. In Colossians 1:15 through 17, if we're being conformed to the image of the Son, what is that image? It says in Colossians 1:15 through 17, Christ is the image of the invisible God. There it is. Christ pushes us forward to be conformed to the image of his Son, which is the image of the invisible God. Crisis in Romans 8:28 pushes us through to be conformed to the image of the invisible God. That's what crisis does. And really, it's truly as simple as that. Our Father has orchestrated dissonance in the soundtracks of our lives. He doesn't allow it. He purposed it and intended it. Oh no, God doesn't want bad things to happen. If he did, he wouldn't make all things work together for the good. Well, you must understand what his good is. That you be conformed to the image of his Son is his good. God has purposed and intended it. He said to Isaiah in Isaiah 45 through verse 7, I form the light, and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I create darkness and evil. I form the light and I make peace. Just like the music, the contrast that pushes us through. But don't be misunderstood. Don't misunderstand. Like I said, our expectations on God far outweigh our understanding. Our understanding needs to be that He purposed it and He intends it. And that's what the Father told me while I was praying about this teaching. The Spirit spoke these words. Your expectations of God far outweigh your understanding. And now we get to the heart of the matter. Our understanding. We already have seen why. But our understanding of crisis, that's something else. What do we understand? Let me now address our understanding from the reality in which we live. Regardless of what you believe, there are only two spiritual realities in which your spirit exists in this life. Let's look at those. The first reality is me knowing about Jesus. This is the reality in which the world exists. It is a reality we read in Matthew 21, excuse me. 7:21 through 24. And not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Now we stop that verse there, and we don't continue. But he continues to say, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock, which is Christ. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like foolish men who built his house on the sand. And when crisis came, when you were the squirrel on the interstate, when bad things happen to good people, as you say, it fell, and great was its fall. When you know about God, when you know about Jesus, and that is the extent of your understanding, if you trust that reality and you believe that there are there are good people, and ask, how can a loving God condemn someone who is trying to live a good life? I've heard that 1,000 times. How can God condemn me when I'm trying to live a good life? You will hear, there are many paths to God. Jesus is but one. But beware, I say to you this. In John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. If this is your reality, the Father will bring you into failure and crisis for one purpose, and that is to push you forward just like that tritone pushes music forward. He gives you crisis to push you forward into Christ so that you may have eternal life. The process of sonship cannot begin until you have received Christ. If that is your understanding and you stand before the Father, He will say, "Depart from me. I never knew you." You can be religious, you can be good, you can be, in your eyes, perfect. But your house in crisis will fall, and I cannot tell you any different. The purpose of that is to push you into Christ. The second reality, and there's only two, is the reality of salvation, the new creation being the spiritual son. And this is what it looks like. This is the second reality. You no longer know about Jesus, but you're born again. You and Christ have union, and in that union becomes a new creation. I want you to look at this picture because we're going to show you a variation on it in a minute. Me and Christ at the cross come into union. I'm crucified with Christ, and I become a new creation, another person. How does Paul word it in 2 Corinthians 5:16? Therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him in this way no longer. And this is important. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. He is a new creature. The old things passed away. Behold, the new has come. Now, I told you there were two realities. There were only two realities. But there is a third, false knowledge and understanding of the new creation, spiritual son. There are only two realities. But Christians today don't understand the new creation. Let me read the lyrics of a song. My brother brought me these lyrics a few nights ago, and he said, I want you to see these. I want you to see how sad this believer is. We have talked about a believer in crisis, where they stand broken at the end of themselves, and they believe God has abandoned them. I want you to let me read these lyrics of this song. It's from the song Never Alone by the Barlow Girl. And she's talking about God. I waited for you today, but you didn't show. No. I needed you today, so where did you go? You told me to call. Said you'd be there. And though I haven't seen you, are you still there? I cried out with no reply. And I can't feel you by my side. So I'll hold tight to what I know. You're here and I'm never alone. And though I cannot see you, and I can't explain why, such a deep, deep reassurance you've placed in my life. We can't separate because you're part of me, and though you're invisible, I trust the unseen. I wanted to call this song 911, Call Me. This is our understanding. And if I could tell you the 600 comments after this song of the people in YouTube who could relate to it. The church, this is the way the church views their, quote, relationship with God. Let's look at this. While there are two realities in which a human spirit can exist, almost every Christian today has a false understanding of salvation. It is what I call the two-person gospel, or the me and Jesus gospel. The Christian has truly received Christ, yet they believe that they and Jesus coexist together in their heart. Me and God. God, where were you when I needed you? Just a second ago, you were standing right here. And now you're gone. While this may be your understanding, and is the understanding of 99% of the church, this spiritual reality does not exist. This understanding, though it be yours, this is not reality. And as in that song, that understanding becomes a source of all of your frustration. Crisis to this believer in this understanding is intended to push them into an understanding of oneness and their identity as the Son of God. This crisis demands faith, and faith moves the new creation believer forward through that dissonance, through that crisis, and the turbulent convergence of oneness. And the beauty of this convergence is that it resolves in the revelation of your true spiritual identity. But let's look at this understanding, the me and Jesus understanding. Let's look at this diagram. You got it up, Jim? Jim's going to bring that up for you. There we go. Look at this. We talked about the two realities and this third false misunderstanding. 99% of the church lives in this false understanding where they have me and Christ. We come to union and now there's me and Christ. The red and the blue coexist together. It is in this understanding that we try to fix ourselves, that we go, this is the Christian in turmoil. This understanding is what causes us all of the frustration and why so many Christians today are walking away from church. Crisis in your life is intended to push you forward into the true understanding on the right, which is not you and Jesus, but you as that purple sun, which is the union of red and blue together, a new creation. This is the understanding I want to speak to. Because if you know about God, Christ pushes you into Christ. If you live in this understanding of me and Jesus, Christ is intended to push you into oneness and identity as this purple sun in the diagram. But what does Christ do? What do those times do when you already are and understand that you're the Son? At this time, I want to tell you about a conversation that I had with the Father about 3 weeks ago. In my drive home, it's a little bit more to use my life as an example. But before I do this, let me preface this conversation by reading an excerpt from my written testimony. I wrote this about a year ago. Some of you have heard it before. At the age of 52, Don Kurtis Luckinbill's life would come apart. Unlike anything that I have ever known or will ever know again. Within a matter of 6 years, I would experience divorce, 3 years of being the sole caregiver to my dying mother in my home, family death, extended unemployment, bankruptcy, and the diagnosis of my own genetically inherited terminal illness. In fact, it was the same diagnosis that killed my mother while in my care. That's a lot to go on. That's one crisis after another. Any of those crises alone, you stack them up, that's quite a mountain. My foundation was rocked, and my identity had come apart. My questions to the Father turned from the theologically profound to the childishly simple, why? Why? Emptied of 60 years of identity, I was standing at the beginning of a new understanding. From that point forward, the Father would orchestrate people and events that would introduce me to the revelation of the Son, of His Son. Men were placed in my life that would introduce me to the Father's plan and intent of the new birth and my oneness and identity as the Son of God. I now saw that a true son could not be made with convincing arguments, lifestyle changes, or church. This son had to be birthed from above. I had spent my entire life trying to make myself a son of God. My life's frustration lay not at the feet of others, but at my own. Wisdom and righteousness would not be found in what I knew, but rather whom I would become. It was those crises that took me to the end of the two-person gospel. When I turned and said, God, where were you? He said, you don't understand. And some of you think often when I teach because I'm ahead of you, and I'm pointing where I've been. Let me tell you, more often than not, I'm just opening the door for you so we can walk through this door together. I ask the same questions you do. I feel the same things you do. I question the same things you do. Many times I teach to you. I'm teaching because I've just learned it. Three weeks ago on a Monday afternoon, I spoke of unemployment. That has been off and on, and for the last year and a half has been on. 3 weeks ago on a Monday afternoon, my distress, my fear, and my doubt had again reached one of those moments of critical mass where I was in my flesh. In desperation to resolve our family's need for just a little bit of additional income, I applied for a midnight shift stocking groceries at the local grocery store. Jenny came home one day and she said to me, Kurtis, I've talked to the manager. You can go up there before 11 and talk to her. I said, good. I went in that morning and I told the manager that 2 weeks earlier I had filled out a job application for an online posted position stocking groceries in her store. She looked me up, looked me down, and said, we filled that position. You need to try another store. I was devastated because the way she looked at me was like, we filled that. And that was it. That was the last drop in my failing bucket. I was devastated. A man that was making million-dollar decisions, but 2 years earlier, couldn't even get a job stacking beans on a shelf at 3 a.m. I reached a point so low that afternoon that I cried out to God on my knees, Why do you not care? Do you not see? I feel so forsaken. Yes, a man who knows he's the Son still can ask that question. You can get so low sometimes that you go, God, why don't you see this? The following is my conversation with the Father and the understanding that He gave me. He gave me 5 things, and I'm going to give them to you like He gave them to me. First, son, Kurtis, there are but 2 choices. Either 1, I have forsaken you, or 2, you do not understand. At that moment, I asked myself, why did I just say that? I know better. But even sometimes what we know is not where we are. Sometimes we know better. But we go to our Father, we go, why aren't you here? We go back to that 2-person gospel because it's what we know. It's what we're comfortable with. I was embarrassed. I know the answer. I know Hebrews 13:5 by heart. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, materialism. Oops. Being content with what you have. 4, He Himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. But no, there goes Kurtis right down the line, saying, God, where are you? Why do I feel so forsaken? And he starts this conversation with, son, you do know that I will never desert you, nor will ever forsake you. And then he goes on and he says, Matthew 27:46, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out on the cross with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the Father said to me, son, there is only one that's ever been forsaken. My only begotten Son. And that was so you would never be. I've only had one forsaken. My only begotten Son. And that was so you, Kurtis, would never be forsaken. That you would never be deserted. Furthermore, son, in Hebrews 4:14 through 16. Therefore, since we have such a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who's been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may find mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. The Son has endured and tempted and endured every weakness we could ever experience, yet without sin. And then he closed this first point, with Zephaniah 3:5. The Lord is righteousness within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail. I said, got it. And he said, second son, you need to live from the inside out. Now, we've heard David teach that in the last month. And I've heard that, and I thought, what does it mean to live from the inside out? This is what the Father said to me. My son, live by faith and not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 7. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we were at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk, that means live. We walk and live by faith, not by sight. The Father says, son, living by sight is living from the outside in. It is letting the temporal world, your circumstances, and your flesh, and your fears define you as the son. It is living in the identity of your flesh, Kurtis. Living by faith is living by what you know and understand. It is living from the inside outward. The identity of the spiritual Son of God now defines what you see and the circumstances that surround you. You are no longer controlled by your fears, what you feel emotionally, or the hopelessness of your circumstances or situations. Living from the inside out is letting the Son define the circumstances. Is letting your understanding of your identity as the Son define the circumstances. Father once told me, things are not as they appear to be. When you live from the outside in, your circumstances and your fears define you as the Son. Third point, Hebrews 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Kurtis, and this is conversation. This is the Spirit talking to me. Walking by faith is living by what you know and understand as the spiritual son to the Father. Walking by sight is living what you physically see, what you hear, smell, taste, and feel. When you live by sight, you only have hope. You can only hope. When you live by faith, you understand the assurance of those things hoped for. Faith takes you beyond the uncertainty of hope and into the certainty of your union and oneness with Christ. How many people say, well, I really hope that's true, Kurtis? You go, no, it's beyond hope, brother. It is. I understand it. It is. When you live by sight, all you have is hope. When you live by faith, when you live from the inside out, that faith, that hope is now assured. And you are convinced of things you cannot see. And he brought up the fourth point. What you see is not real. Things in the natural are not as they appear to be. You may see death, you may see crisis, you may see hopelessness, but Kurtis, that's not real. And you say, well, that real's pretty darn real. I hit that and that hurts. That's real to me. The Spirit said, it may be real and temporal, but it's not eternal. Have you ever asked why Peter calls us aliens and strangers in this world? As a new creation son, you are a fourth dimensional creation. And you are no longer controlled by what you see or hear in this world. That purple, that Christ in you in union becomes a purple creature. And that purple creation is an alien and a stranger in this world. As a new creation son, you are not. You are fourth dimensional. And you are no longer controlled by what you see or hear in this world. You now see with the eyes of your heart, and you listen to the voice of the Spirit. And listen to this. This is what David said last week. The prince of this world can no longer, Satan, can no longer control your emotions through fear. When he does, it is because you have given him an audience. And you have given life to what is dead. That's the only time is when we give him audience and we give life to what is dead. In Romans 8, 12 through 16, therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it's not to the flesh, or to live according to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. Now listen to this. For those who are led of the Spirit of God are children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. Adoption to sonship. That's in the Scriptures. I didn't make that up. And by him we cry what? Father, Abba. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. And lastly, Son, the Father tells me, lastly, Son, and this may have hurt more than anything. 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. The Father said to me so intimately, when you live by sight, Kurtis, you cannot understand my unconditional love. You only understand conditional love. And that was not a teaching. He said to me, Kurtis, you only understand conditional love. Because you define my love with your natural mind. My love cannot be understood in your fear or defined by your three dimensions. And Kurtis, that's the world you live in. When you're in the flesh, you cannot understand my unconditional love because you define it through your fear and through your dimensions, your three dimensions. My love can only be defined and understood in the fourth dimension of the Spirit. For has Paul not taught you, Kurtis, in Ephesians 3:14 through 19, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, so that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit to the inner man, in the inner man. And this is the point, Kurtis, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, the length, and height, and depth. Now, I want you to count that. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 dimensions. That's not 3. That's why the Father said you can only understand my love in 4 dimensions. The fourth dimension of the Spirit. The width, the length, the height, and the depth. And to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. And then he concluded and he says, when you live in your flesh, son, you do not live in an understanding of my unconditional love. Fear and anxiety can only abide in your flesh. For my love never fails. It is eternal. And the eternal is not temporal. He concluded with this in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Let me just say this. Have you ever noticed when we speak to the Father, how gently and softly he speaks to us, how lovingly, like a father, he speaks to us, how patient and how kind he speaks to us. He doesn't speak to us out of arrogance or boasting or, I'm God, you listen. And you know what? It dawned on me, that's the way my Father speaks to me, but that's not the way I speak to others. Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag or is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and Kurtis, love never fails. When you say, Father, why have you failed me? He says, I cannot, because I am love. And love never fails. But now abide hope, faith, and love. But the greatest of these is love. In conclusion, let's go to 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. I want you to know, Paul's been here. The Apostle Paul's been here. You think, oh, Paul, he was too, his revelation was too great to have been here. Paul writes this to this church of Corinth. Unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Now I want you to look at this. For this thing I besought. When you look that word up in the Greek, it means to beg and to plead. God, please, please. Picture Paul on his knees, begging and beseeching the Father 3 times that it might depart from me. This was crisis to Paul. And he said unto me, the Father, Paul, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now Paul says, most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, my sickness, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in illness, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecution, in distress. May I add in crisis, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You were a clay pot. He put this glory in the clay pots that you would break. It was intended that you break. It was purposed that you break. But I got good news for you. Yes, you were designed to break. Yes, you were designed to fail. Because in that failure, you come to an end of yourself, an end of your strength. The Father intended and purposed crisis in your life. He intended it. He purposed it. It just didn't happen, and he goes, oops, I'll make that work out for the good. He intended and purposed crisis. But that crisis was not intended to crush or destroy you. It is in that crisis that he speaks to you and he reveals himself to you and in you. It is all in the process of learning to be the spiritual son to your Father. His strength is made complete and finished, is what that word perfect. His strength is made perfect. It is made complete and finished in your illness, Kurtis, in your suffering, and in your frailty. I make my strength complete and finished in your crisis. From your brokenness flows his essence and his rest. I would tell you to abide in that rest. For this is what the Father wants you to understand. Now is my prayer. May the orchestrator of our salvation and the conductor of sonship open the eyes of our hearts so that we may grasp how wide, how long, and high and deep is the love of Christ. And to know this love that surpasses our knowledge, that we may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Amen.